Oui, bonjour à tous. Comme l'a dit,
Good morning, everyone. As the moderator said, I'm Cyrano OMBOLO. I'm a specialist of programs and policies at the International Labour Office, where we are working in many countries that cover Central Africa. So I'll try to give you a presentation on the issue of youth unemployment across the world and Africa in particular within the framework of globalization, laying emphasis on the challenges, initiatives, and good practices. So the context of the labor market, we know it. We started discussing it yesterday when we talked of the rate of unemployment, and many participants were complaining of the fact that the indicators of the rate of unemployment in Africa don't always match the reality of the African context. But to come back very quickly on that, generally we know that unemployment rates in Africa are low, and that is explained by the definition of used by the ILO for whose the criteria used by ILO to define unemployment. There are three main criteria. So there should be active search for jobs. If a job doesn't look for a job, then we consider him employed. He must be available to do the job that is proposed to him. If he's not available, then he's not unemployed. And the last element is that even if we take someone who has worked for at least 1 week, 1 hour before the investigation, is not considered an unemployed person. So these are the various criteria that member countries of the ILO agreed on to define the concept of unemployment. That's why sometimes we find ourselves in situations where the unemployment rate are very low in Africa, but effectively statisticians have continued working to continue to improve the indicators. Now they talk of extended unemployment, for example. Maybe our friend from the National Institute of Statistics would lay emphasis on that. But that's not what is of interest to us today. Today, there are concepts like underemployment that shows that with an unemployment rate of 80%, the situation is really dramatic for the youth in Africa. Generally, 11 million youth enter the labor market in Africa, but unfortunately, job opportunities are about 3 million. So there is a gap of about 8 million that needs to be provided for every year, creating about 8 million jobs in Africa to satisfy the needs of youth in terms of unemployment. Another element that is important is the concept of poor workers. Out of 100 workers in Africa, 38, about 40 are poor. That is, they wake up in the morning, 4 a.m. to go and work, come back at 6 p.m., but they find it difficult to feed their families because they are poor. They work, but they are poor. That is another issue that needs to be addressed. Another issue is the informal sector. Today we realize that in most big African cities, the informal sector is expanding. Today, almost 90% of workers work in the informal sector. And we know what the informal sector is: precarious working conditions, very low salaries. So hardly 10% of people who work in Africa work in the formal sector. The rest work in the informal sector. Another important element is the lack of efficiency of mobilizing resources in various countries to accompany the various programs on the labor market. There are many initiatives, as we saw yesterday, but we wonder the efficiency of these policies and programs. Of course, there is the issue of the mismatch between training and the job offer, which is a problem which has lasted for over 30 years and which has still not found the right solutions. There is the issue of the increasing demography with the demographic dividend, as the moderator pointed out in his introductory statement. So these are the things that define the context of the labor market in Africa. The main challenges. Here we'll try to discuss the challenges of the labor market in Africa. Generally, it is the challenge between the match between training and employment and the demographic dividend. If African countries manage to address these challenges, then we are very sure that they will create employment opportunities for the youth. The first challenge we'll discuss in detail is the mismatch between labor and the actual needs of economies and the private sector. Unfortunately, it is a challenge that we've been talking about for over 30 to 40 years in Africa. The mismatch between training offer and the needs of companies. Unfortunately, as one of the speakers was saying yesterday, in a country like Cameroon, almost every 100 meters you find a training center who trains youth, and parents of these children pay huge amounts of monies to have their children trained. But we also know that these youth are trained in subjects that are not really needed in the labor market, so they are actually training unemployed persons. So the question is, what are governments doing? What are PESs doing to be able to guide these training institutes to provide trainings that are adapted and that are in line with the labor market? So that is an interesting problem for which we need to find solutions, because we've been talking about it for over 40 years. Unfortunately, there is no change. We keep training our youth in disciplines in which they will not have any job upon graduation. Meanwhile, today, there are other fields of other disciplines that are richer, innovative, that can provide job opportunities for the youth. For example, in agro industry, if we succeed to link the youth in the various agricultural chains, it will give them labor employment opportunities. In processing technologies and conservation of products, development of new energies. But unfortunately, we continue to train our youth in literary subjects, in disciplines, sociology, and the rest, while we know that the labor market does not need such people trained in those disciplines. So effectively, the various governments and public employment services must take the bull by the horns and address these issues, so that only programs that are needed should be funded to solve the problem between the mismatch between the training and the needs of companies. There is the challenge of the weakness of sectoral strategies to promote productive jobs. After the head of states conference of Ouagadougou in 2004, many countries committed themselves to promote the creation of jobs. In most countries, employment was included in their strategy papers, but unfortunately, they didn't go to the end of it. They just ended with good speeches, talking about employment at the center of policies, but not really making it concrete and operational to effectively ease the creation of jobs. In sectors-based strategies, in the Ministry of Infrastructure, in the Ministry of Agriculture, in the Ministry of Livestock, they should define strategies, operational strategies that include issues of employment concretely and precisely. The ILO has accompanied a number of countries to integrate these employment dimensions and made available to some countries a number of tools to help them to integrate these issues of employment in their policies. We have helped the Ministry of Employment in Cameroon to develop a tool to estimate the job potential from the public investment budget. It means when the budget is voted, we can know the employment potential that this public investment budget will generate. It is with such tools that governments can really integrate the issue of employment in their sector-based strategies. We need to come out from political and strategic dimensions and go to operational dimensions where we integrate these employment dimensions. But the issue we have at the ILO is that we can make available some tools to some countries, but due to administrative bottlenecks, they will not be used. A tool like this one, if it was systematized within the framework of budget programming, then it would help countries to choose the projects that are more that can create more jobs and fund them to create more jobs for the youth, because the public investment budget is the tool, the most powerful tool made available to states to address their socioeconomic problems. There is a challenge of inclusive growth. The moderator talked about this. After the socio-political crisis in Cote d'Ivoire, when President Alassane Ouattara came to power, for 3, 4, 5 years, a country like Cote d'Ivoire had a growth rate, a two-figure growth rate, that's 10%, for example. But unfortunately, when you go to Cote d'Ivoire and you question an Ivorian, they will tell you they don't feel this growth. And President Ouattara usually said that money doesn't make noise. That's why Ivorians can feel the positive effect of this growth. But the truth is that effectively in all these countries, growth is not inclusive. It means it doesn't enable ordinary citizens to feel the effects of growth. So it is up to the country to define policies and tools so that concretely this growth should be felt. At the level of the population. I can equally take the example of a country which is not a model maybe, but we have the representative of Tunisia who is here. He can say more about that. I worked in Tunisia for 4 or 5 years for the African Development Bank, and what I found extraordinary in Tunisia is that when we saw the salary level of civil servants in Tunisia and compared by using the exchange rates with the salaries of other civil servants in other countries, it was almost the same thing. But when you look at the quality of life that an average civil servant in Tunisia had, it had nothing to do with the quality of life of a civil servant in another country in Central Africa or West Africa, for example. I'm talking about Tunisia before the Arab Spring. It had nothing to do. Tunisians with the same salaries had a better standard of living. You see, young Tunisians, when they started working, the state had put in place a number of measures to help him have access to lodging, to have a decent means of transportation, and so on. So these are some of the incentives and mechanisms, banking mechanisms, and even tax mechanisms that can be set up by the state so that the growth should really be inclusive, so that it should benefit the entire population. Another important element is the issue of the demographic dividend. The challenge of the demographic dividend. Yesterday we talked of family planning. Someone was purporting that birth rate should be controlled. Effectively, today, we find ourselves in a situation where the active population in African countries will be more than the non-active population. Means the active population will be greater than the non-active population. The non-active population are children below 15 years old and parents, grandparents who are over 70 years who can no longer work. So if the active population becomes greater than the inactive population. I, a young active youth, I have more means because I have less children. Instead of having 6, 10 children like my father, I have 2, 3 children. I just take care of my 3 kids, and then meanwhile my father had to take care of 15 children, his grandparents, and so on, and many other cousins and so on. Today, in the next 30 years, we will get to a stage where the active population, that is youth who are of working age, will be more than those of the inactive population, which means they'll be able to save more, they'll be able to save to invest and pull the economy upwards. But that would only be possible if this active population is effectively working. If this active population is unemployed, then we will not benefit from what the demographers call the demographic dividend. If they get to work effectively, if government defines policies, puts in place training policies that enable these youth to have working opportunities, then we would benefit from the demographic dividend. If not, it will be another load and a time bomb, because we will need to find jobs to over 375 million youth, and I assure you that's not possible. For example, Cameroon, you need to find jobs to about 10 to 15 million Cameroonians. In DRC, where the population, maybe we don't have the last statistics, but the population, there are about 90 million inhabitants. So you need to find jobs to 30 million youth. How do you go about it? So effectively, it could be we need to transform this into opportunity. If not, it would become a situation that will be difficult to manage for many African countries. Then there's the issue of the preponderance of the informal sector. You know, the informal sector is a sector in which it's a very dynamic sector, which we must admit. It is a sector where there is market competition, it's capitalism. If someone succeeds in the informal sector, then in the formal sector, he should have the tools, he's armed to make it. Unfortunately, the reality of the informal sector is that it is working conditions that are not decent. Workers of the informal sector don't have access to banking facilities, they don't have access to social security coverage, it's violation of all forms of work, it's child labor. It's a society in which there is no labor contract, there is no law. It's a sector where people are not fulfilled. So as much as possible, we should try to reduce the informal sector in the African continent. It's a huge challenge, because today in many African economies, 90% of workers are in the informal sector. And we need to see how states and PESs define policies to enable these workers of the informal sector to migrate to, as much as possible, to the formal sector. I know the ILO has accompanied a number of countries by setting up a number of programs to accompany this migration from the informal sector to the formal sector. Now, what are the initiatives we can envisage to try as much as possible to come out from this precarious situation, this situation of underemployment, of generalized underemployment? Of course, there's no miracle solution. There are things you know, but we need to know how to play the records and elaborate policies that can work. But what is important is that you're a varied audience. There are various experiences from various countries, and it's by discussing that we can draw lessons from other countries to see how we can apply them in the context of your own countries. But another important element is that the economic theory teaches us that the growth of sectors such as agriculture, infrastructure, and manufacturing sectors are the sectors in which there are many jobs. It is in these sectors that there are many jobs. It is not in the capital intensive sector like the mining sector, but it is in the agricultural, the infrastructural, the manufacturing sector that there are many jobs, and it is in these sectors that your program should focus to be able to provide employment opportunities for the youth in Africa. The first initiative is activate political institutional levels to integrate the employability of the youth in national development frameworks in Africa. We need to come out from these hollow and vague concepts and implement strategic policies by concrete instruments that effectively create jobs. Because it's very easy to say we have placed employment at the heart of our employment strategy papers, but if there are no specific policies to accompany them, there will be no results. For 20, 30 years, they will say employment is at the center, but there will be no results. I told you the ILO elaborated a tool that helps to estimate the labor potential from the public investment budget. So every government from its public investment budget can estimate the employment potential such that they can choose projects and programs that will generate most jobs. These are concrete tools that effectively enable to place jobs at the center of policies. Promote sub-regional and regional integration. I think is the former president of ANP in Congo who was saying that unfortunately there was low coordination of policies in the level of WAPES, a level of programs to promote employment. There should be a global approach so that the various countries will not go competing against each other in the quest for markets and job creation. A country like Gabon should not go and carry out an agricultural reform on palm oil, knowing that in Cameroon there is a project in that sector. So there is need for a global approach at the sub-regional level in order to develop synergies. It goes in line with training, where excellence training centers can be developed to be able to use resources better and ensure better training of the youth. What does it mean? It means that effectively you need to favor the creation of excellence centers in the various labor-intensive sectors to be able to have concrete opportunities for your youth. PESs themselves have to develop synergies. Why not think of models in which, if there is a deficit in a very precise area in Gabon, workers who have been identified in a labor intensive area like Cameroon or the Democratic Republic of Congo go there to fill the gap. Need to optimize instruments of the job employment policy. I think that countries such as Tunisia can have success stories to share. So we should be able to act on tax incentives, on banking instruments, to as much as possible facilitate the insertion of youth. There should be tax incentives to companies created by the youth so that they should easily integrate active life and come out from the informal sector. The fourth initiative, invest in fundamental education and optimize educational and vocational training systems. There is need for internships, refresher programs are things to be encouraged. It's important to create innovative training opportunities for the youth. This is collaboration with big international institutions like the ILO, ANP, and so on, but ensure that when these technical partners come, they come with tools that match with your needs. As much as possible, adapt these tools developed by these international institutions so that they should be in compliance with your needs. Another important element in the agricultural sector, we know that the agricultural sector occupies close to 60% of the active population in many African countries, but unfortunately the reality is that this agricultural sector is for is smallholders, that's just to feed the family, that productions that have no real potential. So there's need for specific measures to transform these smallholders such that they can be competitive. And the image that comes to my mind, you see, in Africa, they say 60% of the active population is in the agricultural sector. For a production that is low, productivity is low, proceeds are low, salaries are low. Meanwhile, in European countries, it's hardly 4% of the population, of the active population, that's in agriculture. So 4% of the population feeds European countries and even export their excess produce to African countries. So it must lead us to ask ourselves questions. Is it because Africans don't work? I'll say no, because we see how all mothers wake up at 4 a.m. to go to their farms. We see them work. So it's an issue of productivity. It's a product of support, of accompanying them. It's concrete. It's not in the growth and employment strategy paper. These are concrete measures, operational and specific measures that must be developed to accompany these young farmers so that they should come out from traditional economies. And bottlenecks should be removed from the development of the creation of companies by the youth. These are part of the incentives that state PSCs can set up to favor youth entrepreneurship. It is true that in most of our countries, unfortunately, success stories are not an issue of entrepreneurs. In most African countries, when you see someone who succeeded in life, is a politician, is someone who is a minister, he goes to the village, everyone is happy. Meanwhile, we know that a politician really, he has a merit for sure, but we need to promote brilliant entrepreneurs who succeeded such that our children, our younger ones, should be encouraged by the need to succeed in the world, in the business world. In the West, for example, in the US, when a youth graduates from the university, his ambition is to work for 3, 4, 5 years and then get into business. In the African context, when a youth graduates, his ambition is to become a director in the ministry, to become a minister. He doesn't even think of going to the business world. It doesn't even cross his mind. In the worst case scenario, if he gets into business, it's because he will create fake companies to have contracts. But all this needs to change. All this needs to change. There is need for an entrepreneurial culture, and for it to be possible, there must be sensitization, communication, and even training. So in primary schools and so on, the kids need to be trained on success through business, success through entrepreneurship. That too is important. We need to change the paradigm. There needs to be a shift in paradigm which says that only success comes only through the administration. There should be tax incentives to the youth. As I was telling you, the Tunisian example should is relevant to us. We see that there were some measures that were taken in Tunisia and Morocco that enabled the youth to access to enter into the entrepreneurial world. Of course, we have good practices that worked out. We try to pick out a number of good practices that worked out. There is the intensive programs like the HEMO programs, but there are not always HEMO programs according to the ILO. The examples that worked out, for example, where we had huge investments, is in South Africa, for example. A big country like South Africa today, an industrialized country, is still implementing employment intensive programs to address issues of unemployment and underemployment. So labor intensive programs can be an opportunity of direct employment for the youth, and it can help them to have economic opportunities. Of course, public employment services. When public employment services are well organized, they can produce important results. For example, the public employment service of Angola. I don't know if our friend from Mozambique can share us the Angolan experience. I was impressed to see the capacity of this public employment service. We equally have that of Cameroon that has produced a number of results that you know. We equally, to ensure the transformation that is moving from rural organizations to bigger companies, that's from CIGs to cooperatives and so on, could help these smallholders to effectively increase their production. But there is need for support. Absolutely, they should be supported. The agricultural sector should be supported by financial incentives and even banking incentives. And PESs have an important role to play because you are at the heart of the various boards of the PES. There is government, there are a number of stakeholders, and you should play your role of advocacy and ensure that it comes to pass. There are programs to improve informal learning. There's a program in Zimbabwe where this was done. Improve the informal learning program. The moderator can share with us, for example, motorbike riders in Togo. Motorbikes are it's a very important sector in Togo, and there's a program that helps to guide them and give them opportunities. They should not ride bikes all their lives. For those who can go higher, they have an opportunity to do that. And then there is the GME program, Manage Your Company Better, which offers a number of tools to enable the youth to have access to a better job. Thank you for your kind attention.